All right, let's dive into this. Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée. We've got some excerpts here all about this legendary force. And, well, it's a massive story. But we're going to try and uncover how this army, how they go from like a ragtag group, to this symbol of power, revolutionized warfare, reshaped Europe, but in the end, led to Napoleon's own downfall.
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox. You have Napoleon, his genius, his ambition builds this incredible machine of war, but the machine itself and how he used it, that's what leads to his destruction.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to look at. We're talking about an army that could outmaneuver enemies so well that they'd surrender, like without even a major fight.
Yeah.
But then they marched all the way to Moscow, only to be destroyed by the Russian winter.
Exactly, yeah. So to understand this whole thing, we got to start at the beginning. The Grande Armée, it didn't just appear, it evolved from the French Revolutionary Army. But the key is what Napoleon did with it.
Okay, so get into the specifics. Our sources talk about Napoleon, like instilling discipline and professionalism, rigorous training, all that. But was that really so unique? Other armies had training before Napoleon.
Oh, of course, yeah. But Napoleon's approach, it was different. He took that existing system, the one that was all about rote learning and punishments, and he modernized it, introduced a meritocratic system, rewarded skill and initiative, didn't matter what your social background was, and he understood morale, esprit de corps, that stuff, appealed to their sense of patriotism, made them feel like partners in something big, something grand.
But he wasn't just like a drill sergeant. He was a motivator. Even, a bit of a salesman, selling this idea of France's destiny.
Exactly. And that's crucial because this wasn't just an army of Frenchmen. Napoleon, he incorporated troops from all over, conquered nations, allied nations, this incredibly diverse force. Imagine managing that, a multinational, multilingual army.
Wow. And that brings us to his organizational structure, right? Sources mention this division into independent corps. What was the impact of that?
That was revolutionary. So he organizes the army into these self-sufficient corps. Each one has its own infantry, cavalry, artillery. So they're incredibly flexible. They can respond quickly. These corps could operate on their own. So Napoleon could spread his army out over a huge area. And then, bam, concentrate it for a decisive attack, like a giant game of chess, moved his pieces with speed and precision.
So he's giving more autonomy to his commanders out in the field, trusting them to make decisions on the fly. Seems risky, with communication being so slow back then.
It was a risk, calculated one, though, and it paid off mostly. Napoleon, he chose his corps commanders very carefully. He picked the ones that understood his vision, strategically, and who could actually put it into action. This decentralized command structure, it gave him a huge advantage because his opponents were still using, the more rigid top-down command structure.
Yeah. This is what gets me thinking. How does this apply to any organization, really? Delegating effectively, building trust, empowering teams to act independently, but still aligned with a shared vision. These are timeless leadership challenges.
Absolutely, yeah. And Napoleon, early in his career at least, he was a master at this. And this organizational brilliance, you see it in his early victories. They're what put him and the Grande Armée on the map, really.
All right, let's talk about those victories. Our sources, they highlight Ulm, 1805. Prime example of Napoleon's strategic brilliance. But again, what's so special about it? He wins battles, big deal. Other generals did that too.
It's not just about winning, it's how he won. Ulm, it was a masterpiece. Maneuver warfare, but with a twist. Napoleon, he used deception, like feints, to make the Austrians think he was weaker than he really was. And then, bam, he outmaneuvered them, encircled their whole army, forced them to surrender. And he did it with minimal bloodshed. It was a psychological blow, just as much as a military one. You see this pattern throughout his career.
So he's playing mind games, making the enemy believe something that's not true,
yeah,
and then taking advantage of their mistakes.
Exactly. And this ties into a bigger concept, key to understanding Napoleon. The idea of decisive battles. He didn't just want to win a bunch of small fights. He wanted decisive victories. Victories that would crush their morale, break their will to fight, and ideally end the whole conflict in one shot.
Which brings us to Austerlitz, same year later on. This one's famous, the Battle of the Three Emperors. Our sources describe Napoleon outmaneuvering a combined Russian and Austrian force. This solidifies his reputation as a military genius. But was it really genius? Or was he just lucky?
Well, luck, it always plays a role in battle, but Austerlitz, it was way more than luck. Napoleon, he was facing a bigger army. So he deliberately gave up some important ground, the Pratzen Heights, to lure them into a trap. He knew what they were going to do. They got overconfident, and he exploited that. Launched this devastating counterattack, shattered their center, sent them running.
It really does sound like he's playing chess with armies.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out for a second. These weren't just battles on a map. They had real consequences. Austerlitz, Ulm. They reshaped the political map of Europe. They put Napoleon and his Grande Armée in control. What did that mean for the everyday people? Was it liberation, oppression, something in between? That's something to think about as we keep going with this deep dive. So we've seen how Napoleon, he transformed this army he inherited, right? Instilled this incredible sense of purpose and then, bam, used it to achieve these stunning victories. But he wasn't just relying on, old tactics, right? Our sources point to some serious military innovations.
Absolutely, yeah. Napoleon, he was a master at adapting and innovating, taking these existing ideas and pushing them to the limit. Take mass conscription, for example. The levée en masse, that's what they called it. It wasn't totally new, but Napoleon, he used it on a scale never seen before.
So it's not just about having a bigger army. It's about what that means for warfare, for society as a whole. Our sources call this a precursor to modern conscription. But what were the implications back then?
Oh, it was a huge shift. Before Napoleon, armies were mostly professional soldiers, often mercenaries, But with the levée en masse, he tapped into the manpower of France itself. This meant he could field these massive armies, way bigger than his enemies. And they were driven by this new kind of motivation, nationalism.
So it's not just about fighting for a paycheck anymore. It's about fighting for la patrie, for the glory of France.
Yeah.
That's powerful stuff.
Exactly, yeah. And it had this ripple effect throughout society. The levée en masse, it kind of blurred the lines between soldier and citizen, created a sense of shared sacrifice. But it also raised questions about individual liberty and the state's right to demand service. These are questions that we're still asking today.
It's amazing how these innovations, born out of necessity, in battle, end up shaping the world we live in.
Yeah, for sure. And it wasn't just about manpower. Napoleon was obsessed with speed and maneuverability. His armies marched at this crazy pace, covering huge distances to outmaneuver and surprise their enemies.
Yeah, our sources describe them as lightning strikes, always one step ahead. But how did they manage that logistically? Armies back then were notoriously slow and cumbersome, right?
Well, Napoleon, he understood that logistics were key to victory. He streamlined supply lines, introduced standardized equipment. He even reorganized the army's baggage train, made it more efficient. He also embraced the concept of living off the land, foraging for food and supplies along the way, which meant they relied less on these slow-moving supply wagons.
So he's taking what could be a weakness, this need to feed and equip all these soldiers, and he's turning it into a tactical advantage.
Exactly. By being less reliant on fixed supply lines, Napoleon could move his army faster and more freely than his opponents who were tied to these, cumbersome baggage trains and slow-moving supply depots.
Makes sense. And then there's this idea of centralized command, which seems a little counterintuitive given what we've just discussed about independent corps. How did he balance those two things?
It's interesting, yeah. Well, Napoleon gave authority to his corps commanders. He still kept a tight grip on the overall strategy. He had this amazing ability to synthesize information from all these different sources, make quick decisions, and communicate his orders clearly and concisely.
Our sources describe him as having this, intuitive grasp of the battlefield, seeing the big picture while also understanding the smallest details.
Yeah, and his staff officers played a big role too. They were incredibly skilled and dedicated, working tirelessly to gather intelligence, draft orders, and make sure Napoleon's commands were carried out efficiently.
It makes you wonder, though, about the limits of even the most brilliant mind, the most well-oiled machine. Could this centralized command structure, so effective in the early campaigns, could it become a liability as the Grande Armée faced new challenges?
That's a great question, and it's something to think about as we move into a period where Napoleon's, seemingly unstoppable force starts to run into some very real obstacles.
Yeah. Okay, so we left off with the Grande Armée facing these new challenges, and our sources, they point to the Peninsular War, Napoleon going into Spain and Portugal as a turning point. So what went wrong there?
Well, the Peninsular War, it showed a real weakness in Napoleon's whole approach, you see. He was great at conventional warfare, big maneuvers and decisive battles. But in Spain, he's facing a new kind of enemy. It's a people's resistance, driven by nationalism and religious fervor.
So not an army that just lines up for a big battle, more like hit-and-run tactics. They just disappear back into the population.
Exactly, yeah. The Spanish terrain, all mountainous and rugged, it helped the defenders, and they just waged this relentless guerrilla war, ambushing French patrols, disrupting supply lines, making it impossible for Napoleon to really control things. It became a war of attrition, slowly draining the French resources and manpower.
And this is where we meet the Duke of Wellington, right? Our sources describe him as this formidable opponent who would eventually become Napoleon's nemesis. So it made him such a tough adversary.
Wellington, he was a master of defensive warfare and a logistical genius. He understood how important the terrain was. He chose his battles very carefully, using the Spanish landscape to his advantage. Patient, methodical, and willing to adapt, change his tactics to fit the challenges of this specific war.
So he's not trying to out Napoleon. He's playing a completely different game.
Exactly. And he had another big advantage, the support of the British Navy. This meant he could keep his forces supplied, keep getting reinforcements, even while the French were struggling to hold on to the peninsula. The Peninsular War, it was a costly distraction for Napoleon, a war he couldn't really win, and it showed those vulnerabilities that his enemies would use against him later on.
It really makes you think how even the best military minds, they can be challenged when things are unexpected, right?
Yeah.
By opponents who don't play by the rules.
Absolutely. And probably the most devastating example of this is Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. From the beginning, this campaign was dangerous, a gamble that went terribly wrong.
Our sources, they describe this as the turning point, this disaster that, shattered the idea that the Grande Armée was invincible. What caused such a catastrophic failure?
Well, a few things. First, the sheer scale of it was just unprecedented. Napoleon, he put together the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men. But even that wasn't enough to conquer the vastness of Russia.
And then there's the Russian strategy, right? They weren't exactly lining up for a decisive battle like Napoleon wanted.
Yeah, no, the Russians, they, under General Kutuzov, they adopted the scorched earth policy as they retreated, burning crops, destroying villages, poisoning wells, denying the French any food or supplies.
Oh, so they're turning their own land into a weapon, preventing Napoleon from getting that quick victory he needed.
Exactly. Napoleon gets drawn deeper and deeper into Russia. His supply lines stretch thin. His army is getting more exhausted, demoralized. And then the Russian winter hits. One of the harshest winters ever recorded. The Grande Armée, they weren't prepared for that kind of cold. Huge losses from frostbite, starvation, disease.
It's a crazy image, this once mighty army, just decimated by the brutality of nature.
Yeah, and the retreat from Russia, it was a nightmare. Only a small part of the Grande Armée made it back, and those that did, they were just broken, physically and mentally. The invasion of Russia, that's the turning point in Napoleon's story. The myth of his invincibility gone, his enemies are emboldened. It really set the stage for his downfall.
It's hard to believe this incredible rise to power, this unstoppable force, brought down by hubris, bad decisions, and just the harsh Russian landscape.
It is quite a story. But the legacy of the Grande Armée goes beyond just winning and losing battles. It had this huge impact on military thinking, on the politics of Europe, on the very idea of warfare itself.
Let's break that down, that legacy. Our sources, they highlight a few key areas where the Grande Armée made its mark. First, military innovations. Napoleon's focus on mobility combined with that centralized command structure. It influenced military thinking for, generations.
Yeah, and his use of artillery, that was revolutionary too. He understood concentrated firepower, developed new tactics for using artillery on the battlefield. These innovations, they changed the way wars were fought.
And then there's the cultural impact, something our sources mention. This idea that the veterans of the Grande Armée, the ones who came home, they spread Napoleonic ideals throughout Europe.
Yeah, it's complicated though. Some veterans, they definitely became agents of change, promoting ideas about nationalism, liberalism, even revolution. But others, they were disillusioned, scarred by what they'd seen.
So it's not a simple story of heroes coming home to spread enlightenment.
No, not at all. The Grande Armée was a reflection of French society, with all its complexities and contradictions, and its legacy is just as complex.
And finally, the Grande Armée, it remains this powerful symbol, a symbol of French military power, of course, but also a symbol of ambition, both its triumphs and its dangers.
Yeah, it reminds us that even the most brilliant minds, the strongest armies, they're not invincible. They're subject to the same forces of history, the same human weaknesses that shape all our lives.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Napoleon's Grande Armée, I'm left with this feeling of awe at what they accomplished, but also a sobering awareness of the cost of war, the human cost, that often gets lost in the stories of victory and defeat. It's a legacy that still affects us today, making us think about power, ambition, and the enduring human desire for both conquest and peace.